Good afternoon, Inspector. Just to let you know, we are live on YouTube.
Right, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Is everyone here at the moment? Yes. Right, so the inquiry is resumed. Anything that anyone wants to raise before I hand over to Mr. White to call his witness on landscape matters? In that case, I'll hand over to Mr. White to call your witness, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Can I call formally the first witness of the appellant? That is Mr. Smith.
Good afternoon, sir. Hopefully you can hear me clearly, sir.
I can hear you. You're not as clear as you were the previous time I listened when you had, I think you had headphones and a microphone on.
I've got a microphone right in front of me, sir. So if that doesn't work, I can revert to the headphones.
Right. Well, I can hear you enough, but if it is a problem, we might have to do that. But anyway, yeah.
By all means.
Great. Can I introduce you to the inquiry, please, Mr. Smith? And your qualifications and experience are at page 1 of your proof of evidence. You are a director with SLR Consulting Limited. You
Yes.
are a founding member of their landscape architect practice, which now has over 70 landscape staff across the UK, Australia, and USA.
Yes, over 100 now, actually.
Over 100 now. Wow. Okay. You're a chartered landscape architect and you have practiced for over 30 years.
Yes.
You have a degree in geography from the University of Nottingham and a postgraduate diploma in landscape architecture from Sheffield.
Correct.
And whilst working in landscape practice, you specialised in the landscape planning and landscape and visual assessment. In the past 15 years, you focused on the design and assessment of residential developments throughout the UK.
Yes.
And doing that, you've given evidence in numerous appeals, both for and against development proposals.
Yes.
And you've also written guidance for some local authorities, such as Oxford City and Harrow Borough, on protected views.
Yes.
Additionally, you've also were one of 4 landscape architects that recently co-authored new guidance on landscape value and Power 174 valued landscapes on behalf of the Landscape Institute.
Correct.
In relation to this matter, you instructed in September 2020 to carry out a site-based review of the potential landscape and visual constraints, and you were also asked to review the master plan prepared by the previous architects, Rummy Design, which was the original application of the 250 units.
Yes.
And the application was subsequently refused. After that, you were then asked to consider changes to the proposal and to work with the team to provide a revised master plan.
Yes.
And then obviously that master plan made its way through the system to the application April 21, which was accompanied by the LVA, which we've looked at extensively this morning. And then also you were asked if you would give evidence subsequent to the refusal in relation to various degrees 2, 3, 4, and 8, and based upon your knowledge of the site and your involvement in the preparation of the master plan and the LVA, you accepted the instruction.
Correct.
Great. Okay. Could we then, sir, with your leave, I'd like to take the evidence as read, and I've got some supplementary questions in the light of Mr. Withercomb's evidence. And I want to start off, please. Can I just ask you to identify, for the inquiry's benefit, the existing position and the elements that you would like to draw out of the baseline, the existing character and appearance of the appeal site, please, Mr. Smith?
Yes, with pleasure. First of all, sir, if I could take you to the landscape character plans in the LVA, that's CD 1.12. And the landscape character plans I'm going to refer to are T2A and T2B.
Yes, I've I've got those, yes.
Thank you, sir. The point I just wanted to make on this, sir, very briefly, is that we're on the edge of a national character area. So the big, bold, blue dashed lines show the national character areas. We are within the high weald, and just to the northeast of our site is the low weald. It's quite important because you can actually experience that transition from the east of the appeal site. Second point I wanted to make, sir, is if you look at T2B, this is the Ashford Landscape Character Assessment classification. And it shows that our site is obviously enclosed by settlement to the northwest and to the south. And then to the site and the area to the northeast of the site is classified as Area 23, the Woodchurch undulating farmlands. And that, sir, is how we then arrive at the classification of the site as part of the Woodchurch undulating farmlands. And if I can, I'd like to just drill down in a little more detail and talk about the characteristics of the site itself. In that regard, if I can first of all ask you to, or actually, if you continue with my drawings in the LVA, next drawing along actually would be a useful starting point, T3. We don't need to spend long on this because Mr. White went through this with Mr. Withicombe. The plan clearly sets out 5-meter changes in elevation. So each colour block is 5 meters. Obviously 5 meters is quite a significant amount. And it shows, as we touched on this morning, that there's a northwest to southeast trending ridge across the site. It is less prominent towards the south, but it is still clearly there as a matter of fact. And what it also does, by having a ridge across the centre of the site, it means that the contours are orientated towards the east on the east of that ridge, i.e. facing open countryside, and they are orientated towards the west, to the west of that ridge, i.e. facing the settlement edge. And that has all sorts of implications in terms of visibility, in terms of the containment of existing light, visibility of the existing settlement edge, and so on and so forth. So in terms of, if we then, we're broadly agreed, I think, between myself and Mr. Withicombe that the site does fall into those two main character sub-areas. The western part of the site, if we turn to plate 2 and 3 in my proof, so, sir, that's pages 40 and 41.
Yeah. Yes,
Thank
I've got
you.
that.
Thank you, sir. And so plate 2 is just a shot there of houses on Woodchurch Road. And as you can see, there's some garden vegetation there, some trees on the boundaries of gardens, but obviously you can still see the houses. Quite importantly, the houses are on quite high ground there. If you flick back to the topographic plan in T3, you can see that there's also a dark green along Woodchurch Road. So the houses on Woodchurch Road are actually much higher than most of the proposed development area in the appeal site. We then have.
So can I just ask, these photographs, what time of year were these taken?
These were taken last November.
November. So that's when there's less foliage on the trees, isn't it?
Correct, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know whether you can outline what difference that will make on the visibility side.
I'm happy
Yeah.
to do so, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I tell you what, can I, if it's okay, what I'll do is I'll talk about the Appledore edge, and then I'll talk about both of them in the summer.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So the Appledore edge is shown on page 41, plate 3. Just as an aside, by the way, Mr. Withycombe has said something about these photographs not being from publicly accessible points. I'm not sure that that has any bearing on effects on character. The point is that these things exist. They exert an influence on character, regardless of whether you can see them from the public right of way or not. And again, it is common ground between us, I think, that the Appledore edge is much more exposed. You can see that there are fewer trees, that the boundary vegetation is less developed along that edge. So to answer your question in that context, what I have found, sir, is that houses along the Woodchurch Road edge, it becomes limited to glimpses of houses. You're still clear that they are there, but the foliage covers more, obviously, of the houses. And obviously, when you look at plate 2, you can see that. You can see exactly what the extent of branches is, and to what extent that view would then be screened by leaves. So without a doubt, there will be less visibility of houses in the summer months, but you're still very clearly on the settlement edge. It's rather different for the Appledore edge. Of course, there are still trees there, but they are they have less of a screening and filtering effect. And so the Appledore edge, in my experience, tends to be pretty prominent most of the year. And the other point I would just make, sir, about that is plate 5. So again, and it's interesting how when you look at this, I'm sure you're familiar with the CPRE's dark skies map, sir, and that tends to, by satellite, identify 400-meter grid squares and the intensity of night light that's experienced in those areas. And that very clearly shows really where the ridge has its effect, where it starts to screen the wider countryside. And you can see the blues and purples in the open countryside to the east, whereas there's yellows and greens to the west, not surprisingly, because obviously there would be lighting from the settlement edge. So in terms of these two sides, and maybe to finish the picture, I should go to plate 1, which is a view from the eastern side of the site. That's on page 39 of my proof, sir. And from a number of places on the eastern side of the site, you have very attractive long views out towards the Low Weald and out towards the AONB. Now, to my mind, sir, there is therefore a very clear difference in character between these two areas. One is much more open, that is the eastern area. One is more enclosed, the western area. One is more influenced by the settlement edge, definitely the western area, far more remoteness and ruralness on the eastern side of the appeal site. And I don't think, I mean, I suppose one thing I should just say to respond to a point raised by the council, I don't think we can characterise the edge at the eastern side of the site as wooded. I think you could say that the Woodchurch Road side is treed, but wooded implies to me that there's a depth of tree planting, but there's definitely treed. The Appledore side is not wooded in any way, shape or form. Again, it has some trees without a doubt. But I think where we do agree is that there's a transition across the site. We go from something influenced by the settlement to the west. We go over the ridge. It becomes more rural, more remote, and then to open countryside beyond. if Mr. White, if I'm allowed, if I could just, I don't think we need to spend long on Appledore Road, but could I just touch on that as well? Thank you. So we, as I say, I don't think we need to spend long on this because we touched on this yesterday. Plates 6 and 7 on pages 44 and 45 of my proof. They show the character of the streetscape on Appledore Road. Fundamentally, this is a suburban streetscape. It's a 40-mile-an-hour road. It's reasonably busy. There's regular traffic passing along this road. It has street lighting along most of its length. In this locality, we have fronting 20th century houses. Broad grass verges. And yes, mature trees are definitely a characteristic element. And but the trees that are visible in the vicinity of the site are not just in the avenue, they are also other mature trees. And in that regard, I would recommend, sir, in terms of character, that it'd be worth turning to Mr. Jones' Appendix 3, which we touched on yesterday, which shows the character of the trees in the vicinity of the site access. And as we touched on yesterday, there's obviously a lot of trees that have been removed from the avenue. There are still some existing trees from that avenue. And then shown in blue, there are a lot of other trees that have quite a presence in terms of amenity value. The overall effect of those is to create a treed approach to the settlement, but one which is not following a rigid formula or pattern.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Smith, can we then take those elements and can we look at your proof in table T1, where you do your assessment of value, please, of the appeal site currently?
Yes, certainly. So, sir, the new guidance that I helped to draft for the Landscape Institute came out after I had prepared the LVA. And so I thought it was worthwhile doing a reassessment. The changes were relatively minor. It still obviously flags up that there's a difference in value between the western and eastern sides of the site. Not surprisingly, of course, because the scenic quality of the western side of the site is less than that of the eastern side of the site. The distinctiveness of the eastern side of the site is greater than the western side of the site. And the perception of wildness and tranquility is greater at the eastern side of the site than it is at the west. That one of the main functions that has been added to the assessment criteria or the recommended criteria is the functional attribute. And one of the things to consider there is whether a landscape has a relationship with a national landscape designation. And in my judgment, there is a relationship between the eastern edge of the site and the AONB. It's obviously abutting the AONB and it has intervisibility with the AONB. And therefore, that is another factor from my perspective that elevates the value at that end of the site, but obviously doesn't affect the value of the western end of the site. So therefore, my overall assessment, sir, is a community value at the west of the ridge, local authority value to the east of the ridge.
Thank you. Now, can I deal with, then let's look at, dive into a bit your LVA, and can we just have a look about, obviously, as we discussed this morning, the LVA makes various judgments in reaching landscape character and visual effects by looking at the baseline. And can I just ask you just to walk the inspector through the judgments that you formed in reaching effectively the conclusions that are set out in the LVA, please?
Yes, I mean, I'm conscious that there's happily a lot of agreement between myself and Mr. Withycombe on this point. We have, I think, a large measure of agreement on the methodology, the landscape receptors, the viewpoints, and indeed most of the judgments that are within this report. So happily, that makes our jobs a lot easier. It then becomes a question of how we interpret this and how we apply it. But I will just briefly go through how this runs. It's structured. I mean, our methodology was written with the help of Cara Swanwick, who wrote Glivia 3. So it's something that really follows the guidance quite carefully. We have in terms of the landscape, obviously does landscape and visual, as Mr. White quite carefully said, and he's had his wrist slapped so many times, he knows that landscape and visual are separate matters. So it deals with the two matters separately. And for each of landscape and visual, as again, he said this morning, you have to assess sensitivity and you have to assess the magnitude. And if I turn to the tables, which effectively show my assessments, we have the tables for the landscape assessment in tables D1, D2, D3, and D4. D1 is the box 5.1 based assessment of value, which has obviously now been superseded by the table 1 within my proof, sir, which follows the TGN 0221, which is the new guidance produced by the Landscape Institute. Then you have table D2, which is sensitivity of landscape receptors, which is based on a combination of value and susceptibility. I won't dwell on these. I'm just going to go straight to the conclusions effectively. Magnitude is then assessed in table D3, and that is based on size and scale, geographical extent, and duration of effects. Just a point to note there, geographical extent is the extent of the receptor, or indeed wider than the receptor that would be affected. That has a relevance later on. And then we come to the meat and potatoes, which is D4, the assessment of landscape effects. Now, what I chose to do, which I think Mr. Withycombe seems to have accepted, is I've gone for a very detailed list of receptors, landscape receptors, because I knew this was a sensitive site. So rather than just say, here's an assessment of landscape effects, I've assessed a lot of different receptors. And what I would like to point out is that some of these receptors are actually quite small. They are relatively small areas, and some of them overlap quite a lot as well. So for example, if you look at open sloping fields, enclosed pasture fields, the first one, and a football pitch to the west of the footpath, some influence from the settlement edge, that is the same area as under overall character, enclosed wood church, undulating farmlands west of the footpath. So it follows that if you have a major moderate effect on the first enclosed pasture fields, you will end up with a major moderate effect on that one. Now, I have to say that normally when I'm making character judgments, I deal with wider areas than this. But for this site, as I say, because of its sensitivity, I've chunked the site up into quite small units. And one of the results of that is that if you, for example, introduce 145 homes into an area and therefore occupy around 40% of that area, then it's very likely that you're going to occupy a large size or scale and a large geographical extent of that receptor. And that means that you are likely to come up with quite high magnitudes. So, sir, I'm hoist by my own petard in some ways. I have actually created very detailed landscape character areas in order to assess effects. And that is why we end up with very high effects. But I don't have a problem with that. I want to very objectively and honestly assess what the effects are. And as I say, those two landscape receptors have the same level of effect. It's important, as Mr. White was pointing out, though, to not just deal with that in isolation, because obviously there are other receptors that need to be considered here. And I think Mr. Withercombe agreed with this in cross-examination. Obviously, the other part of the appeal site is the open sloping fields to the east, and that has some negative effects, but mostly positive effects from habitat creation, new recreational opportunities, the new orchard. And in terms of the network of hedgerows and ponds and mature trees, again, we have a positive effect. There is a significant amount of additional planting, and I don't think Mr. Withercombe seemed to disagree with that. We have some negative effects to the prominence of St. Mildred's. There will be some views that would be blocked, but at the same time, there are still plenty of views that would not be screened. And we have some good vistas through the site, for example. So there's going to remain opportunities. So that characteristic of the western end of the site will remain. So the only thing I would just touch on here again is, obviously it's common ground between us. There would be very little effect on the AONB. The effects on the tree-lined streetscape of Appledore, in fairness to Mr. Withercombe, he said that the effects he thought sensitivity should be slightly higher, I think, but I'm very clear that the loss of one tree in a streetscape that is so varied would cause, yes, negative effects, but very minor negative effects on the character of that street. So where we end up with this, sir, is that obviously it's localized landscape effects. And yes, there are major moderate effects to the character of the western end of the site, but I'd like to come back to that in a bit to explain that. In terms of visual, if I may, briefly, there's less to say, I think, about it. We have gone through the same process. We've chosen representative viewpoints. We agree about those viewpoints. We've obviously assessed the sensitivity of those viewpoints. We've looked at the magnitude of effects. And where we've ended up, and Mr. Withercombe agreed with this in his cross-examination this morning, was we've ended up with agreement that the effects are really focused on users of AB12, either next to the appeal site or on the appeal site. So very localized visual effects. I wonder, actually, in that, is it a good time for me, Mr. White, to just explain a little bit more about, because we have dealt with these major moderate negative effects. I wonder if, can I drill down a little bit further into that and just explain that, please? Because one of the things I would say, and I wonder, sir, in this context, so we've got these, in overview, we've got some beneficial effects, we've got some localized negative effects. And I know that this morning, and certainly in chief, Mr. Withercombe focused understandably on these negative effects. But if so, we could turn to the photo montage for viewpoint B, which is T56, I think it is, at the back of the LVA. Yes, it is, T56. So what you have, tell me if you have that, sir, please.
Sorry, which one are you looking at again?
I'm looking at the photo montage, year 5 for viewpoint B at the back of the SLR LVA, and it's drawing number T56. And I think if you're looking at it digitally, oh gosh, I don't know which parcel of drawings it's going to be. I have a hard copy because I'm old-fashioned.
I've got a whole set of, when you say I've got different viewpoints, and then
are you able to see the drawing references, bottom right hand corner, sir?
Bottom, oh right, bottom right, sorry. Ah, yes, I've got numbers now. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see that. They're quite small.
No, they are small, but the problem is actually they're actually A1 drawings.
Yes. So I need to increase the size of that number to be able to look at it.
T56.
I've only, as far as I can see, that goes up. These. I've only got up to, oh no, sorry, I misread it. Yes, I've got T56 now, sorry. Lovely. I just couldn't read the writing, it's so small. It was,
yeah, this is the problem. Again, it's the LI guidance. It has to be, they're meant to be prepared at A1.
No, that's fine. And now I've enlarged it a bit, I can see it better now. Yeah.
I blame wind farms for this. So if you look at the top image, sir, you can see the Tower of St Mildred's in the distance. There's telegraph poles, but it's a largely pastoral landscape, some glimpses of the settlement edge. And we are standing on the footpath here. So we are walkers, and we're therefore, we're on a local authority footpath. It's therefore sort of a medium value, but we're of high susceptibility because we are walkers and they are known to be focused on the countryside. So we end up with a medium high sensitivity in this location. And what I have assessed for this viewpoint, sir, is, I don't know if you're able to sort of stick a thumb in the visual assessment as well. I have assessed for this viewpoint B that there would be major moderate effects, so that we've got a high medium sensitivity, substantial medium magnitude. So I'm reading that from table E3 where we've just been. And I just thought it'd be worth just touching. This is, when we look at this, this is the conundrum that we have here. It is good practice to concede that putting houses in an open field is a negative effect. But when you look at this view, what you see is a retention of existing vegetation, retention of views to St Mildred's. Yes, you see houses very clearly in the foreground, but they don't occupy the large part of this view. And what does occupy the centre of this view is the new greenway, which is 50, 60 metres wide. It's got a new pond, it's got existing ponds, it's got new habitats, it's got new recreational opportunities. So the reason I'm just highlighting this is because in landscape and visual terms, this is a negative effect and quite a high one. I would argue that in master planning and landscape design terms, this is a successful design. It's an active edge. It's a low density edge. It's something that has greenways that will lead to the town centre. It has the ability to have contact with nature, informal recreation, formal recreation. It's got everything that good design of settlement edges should have. So, sir, the key issue here is that still has to be recorded as a negative visual effect. So I just wanted to make that point, Mr. White.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swift. Right. Next thing then, I want to place in context. We obviously, Mr. Withycombe was resilient in retaining his view that he expressed in chief. His summary of the position was that there would be substantial adverse landscape and visual effects based on your tables, subject to his amendments, which he set out. Do you recall that?
I do.
Now, I just want the inspector to have your comparative evidence, having looked at effectively table D4 and E3. What would be your summary of the consequences of the proposal in terms of their effect on landscape character and visual effects?
There would be localized major moderate landscape and visual effects, but they would be focused on an area which also already has some influence from the settlement edge. So at that end of the site, you are aware that you are close to the settlement edges for the reasons that I've already touched on. And therefore, I absolutely acknowledge that those effects will occur, but they are focused on just part of the site, and other parts of the site would experience beneficial, positive effects. And it's also important to notice that very sensitive receptors, landscape receptors near to the site, the AONB, conservation area, other parts around the site would be affected to a very minor degree.
Now, on the inspector has, we know from this morning and from what the development plan contains, is that Ashford Borough Council decided to allocate a site of 225 units at Tent 1.
Yes.
And I just want to know, to what extent, if any, do you take the view that that allocation is relevant or not for the inspector to gauge the kind of significance of the effects that is being considered in this appeal?
I think it's highly relevant, and I would invite the inspector to pop down to that site and walk the footpaths that cross that site. Now, of course, I appreciate it's an allocated site. To that extent, it is completely different from a planning perspective, but that's, planning is above my pay grade. So I'm just a landscape architect. And from my point of view, they are both greenfield sites, which may be possibly subject to residential use at some point. So and they're both on the edge of the same settlement. And I think, both of them are next to the AONB. Both of them are crossed by footpaths. There are therefore quite a lot of important similarities between these sites. And I think that the key things that I would like to point out on this are that there is no way, if you run, and you will go yourself, and I'm sure that you will run through a mental assessment, if you consider the susceptibility of that site, those open fields, to built form, notwithstanding the fact that Tent 1A has already been built out, Tent 1B, still open fields next to the AONB. If you consider that susceptibility, and if you think then about the degree of change that would occur if you put houses, 225 houses on that site, there can be no doubt that there would be a high degree of both landscape change and, for the footpaths crossing that site, visual change. And so equally importantly, what we have here is we have a gateway to the settlement, a well-used road. The view that I have at plate 7 on page 63 of my proof is taken from a bridleway on the edge of a conservation area, looking across that site.
Wait, just let the inspector get that. Just wait, Mr. Smith. Page 63 of your proof.
Yes, plate Roman 7.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
and what we see in the distance there is we're looking towards the AONB. So there's no doubt about it, that's a rural outlook. And what we see, that lens of green field we see there is the allocation. So, you know, even on this road, which is a less sensitive receptor, even on this road, you would certainly go have some fairly high levels of change. For users of this bridle way, who would be quite high sensitivity, you're going to see a high magnitude of change. There is no doubt, therefore, that you would get at least major moderate effects. Now, I'm not seeking to say that this is any worse than our site. I suppose the reason that I've included this is because I think it's really important to understand that you will get negative landscape and visual effects wherever you develop on green fields. And this is certainly the case with this one. I would argue actually this is less contained than the appeal site.
Thank you. Can we
Wait,
then...
can I just mention, I did have a bit of confusion over these plates because there's 2 plate 7s, but this is where I got confused when there was, but in the proof, but this really should be plate 8, but strictly speaking.
Right, so if that's the case, then I'm clearly my Latin numbering is. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There you go. It must have been a late night. Sorry about that.
But that's where I got confused when I was asked to look at plate 7, because that was the
Yes.
one.
You know, that's the first time I've actually noticed that. I'm sorry, isn't it amazing how many times?
No, that's all right, but I just wanted to clarify it just to.
Should we just make it clear? Should we call the one on page 45 plate 7A and the
Yes.
one on page 63 plate 7B?
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, I think that's going to be easier to follow then, as to which plate we're looking at. But I think it's fairly obvious they're different sites. But yeah, just so that if it's going to be referred to in any of the evidence, then they can be looked at differently. Anyway, sorry about that, but
You're right.
I better mention that in your as you're going along. But
absolutely.
I'll hand over.
Right. Next point, Mr. Smith. Can you just deal with? Yes, I discussed with Mr. Withercombe your involvement and SLR's involvement. Can you just describe to the inspector, we touched on this when we were introducing you, to what extent did you have an input, if any, in relation to the evolution of the scheme that now sits before this appeal?
I was given the opportunity to have a very strong influence on the design of this site. Obviously, I was asked to review the original scheme for 250 homes, and I felt that needed changes to it. And it's incredible if you think about it that weights allow me the latitude, not just me, to actually change the number of houses from 250 to 145 and to make a number of other significant changes. So I would characterize the design process as it was certainly landscape-led, not just landscape. Ecology had a very heavy hand on this as well. Trying to enhance biodiversity was a key aim, providing recreational opportunities, again, a very important part. So we, and what was also clear is that our master planners had a computer model of the development. We didn't just design this in 2 dimensions. We designed it in 3 dimensions. We were walking greenways. We were looking at views towards St Mildred's. We were checking the visibility of the whole development. So from an early stage, and every time we changed development parcels, we were able to check what the effect of that was. So it's a very much, landscape, ecology, yes, heritage, and other disciplines, of course, all involved in this. But also the involvement of an architect and master planner who had created a 3D model which enabled us to test everything. So given a free hand, landscape-led, and I have to say I'm very proud of the resulting design.
Thank you. Can I then ask you, to take up the master plan that we have, which is in, I think it's in your LVA.
Yes.
It's one of your
T4.
No, not T4, T2. Yeah, no, it is T4.
Yeah.
T4, right. I just want to deal with this issue of settlement edges and a comparison between what is found when the inspector walks through the site, effectively almost follows what is prospective path AB70 along the edge of the Woodchurch Road houses, turns the corner down to Appledore and round. Could you just compare your perception and judgment about the settlement edge now as opposed to the nature of the settlement edge as it will become post-development, please?
Yeah, certainly. So at the moment, we know that the settlement edge is formed by the backs of properties on Woodchurch Road and Appledore Road. So it's garden boundaries and effectively houses back on to the appeal site. The appeal site itself has a degree of influence from those houses, and we've already discussed this about the visibility of those houses and obviously the lighting and the noise at that end. But at the moment, that western part of the site still comprises fields and some broken hedgerows and some mature trees. But obviously, at the moment, there is no formal access to that western part of the site. So, you know, when we talk about the transition from the existing settlement edge through the appeal site to the open countryside, in human terms, there is no transition because really people can't make that journey. I know people do walk the site, but obviously at the moment it's private land. And the only formal right of way is AB12, which goes north to south across the centre of the site, roughly along the ridge. Now, ecology again is above my pay grade, but I am reliably informed by Mr. Goodwin that the ecological value of the site at the moment is not particularly high. So there's another aspect of the existing function of the site in terms of setting that is somewhat wanting. But what you do get in terms of setting is you can walk AB12 and you do get these glimpsed views. And they are glimpsed, they're not continuous, glimpsed views towards the Tower of St Mildred's across the appeal side. So in terms of setting, the transition then at the moment is backs of properties, land, open land, to which there is no recreational access and which has low ecological value, I am informed.
Yeah, sorry, I think we'll keep up the lower because I think we'll
No, fair point.
I think I prefer it if you stuck with your landscape area, and then we'll go into the ecological value later. I think that's going to be otherwise you'll be straying into areas where you could be asked questions and you wouldn't have your own knowledge on that. I think
completely fair, sir, and I am trying to qualify what I'm saying. It just has a bearing on a landscape judgment. So to that extent, I have to touch on it. But it has a bearing on landscape value. It has a bearing on setting. So I'm afraid I will try and minimise what I say about it.
Yeah, I think we're going to look at the ecology later. So there's quite a bit of contested evidence on that, the ecological value of it. So
yes.
Right, thank you.
I will. I literally. Well, I will absolutely minimise what I say on ecology going forward. I'll take that point.
Right. Thank you.
So, what will the edge become, as shown by T4? I think the big thing I would say is it's a permeable edge, and this is best practice in landscape terms. It's an edge where you will be able to use one of 4 greenways, in fact, a range of different routes through the site. You can walk, obviously, to the town centre. You can walk from the town centre to the country park. The whole of these open spaces through the residential area and obviously the country park are all available for recreational use. The scale of those greenways is very significant. Sometimes they're as narrow as 20 metres, although that's still pretty good in my experience for residential greenways. Generally, if you look at the central greenway, it's 50 or 50 plus metres wide. And obviously it's not just a matter of size, it's something they include the existing hedgerows, ponds, and grasslands. So you have here something that is permeable with many more recreational opportunities. It provides true blue-green infrastructure. It's something that includes flood management and wet ecological features, and also the ability to contact nature all the way along those routes. And importantly, and I really stress this, importantly, there are houses looking on to these routes. And that's good design. They're fronting onto these routes because obviously it creates informal surveillance. There is active edge to the north and south of these greenways. It means that people not only have a lot of space to be able to use those areas for recreation, it means that they can feel safe in those areas. And again, I would stress that is a good design. It's a very effective settlement edge. But this is also a settlement edge that retains some of the key features of the existing site. So retaining the existing vegetation, reinforcing that with new planting, retaining the existing mature trees, adding new trees, and of course, retaining the views of St Mildred's. And I mentioned that, there's this existing setting function, if you like, from AB 12 of seeing the Tower of St Mildred's glimpsed in gaps in the hedgerows, and you would still be able to see some of those views of St Mildred's, and I've obviously shown those in photomontages for viewpoints 5 and B and 9. But obviously, because you've got recreational access to the whole of the western end of the site, you will also see St Mildred's from other areas that you can't formally get access to at the moment. And that's bite into the fact that it's a very loose, low density development. You have therefore sufficient space to still get those views. So overall, sir, and obviously then you've got the country park, which gets enhanced, more habitats, the orchard, and more recreational access. So what you end up with is you retain the transition from the existing settlement edge through low density development, through greenways that lead you along attractive paths, safe paths with fronting residential development out towards a country park with the right to roam, retaining the open views, and you still get some of the distinctive characteristics of this area, the trees, the hedgerows, the view to St Mildred's. So, sir, I would say this is a good, effective settlement edge design.
Thank you. Can I then finally, please, Mr. Smith, just ask you about AB 70? And we heard Mr. Withercomb's contention about these broad landscape corridors and the consequences of AB 70 if confirmed. Now, I just want to ask your view from your evidential perspective. In your judgment, you've seen Mr. Ross's material that we went to yesterday afternoon. I just want to ask you, first of all, whether, if confirmed, it can be accommodated in your judgment with the master plan, and also what will it actually feel like for those users who walk around the development if it is confirmed?
Yeah, the plan that Mr. Ross includes at the back of his evidence shows that the path can be accommodated. Is it? Obviously, it's not. That path is not passing through the same places and character areas that it currently that are currently on the site. There would be changes. However, let's be clear about this. At the western end of the site, if you were following the route of AB70, you would still have a clear perception that you're on the settlement edge. You're still going to get all those things I've talked about, the visibility of buildings, obviously the lighting, the noise. So, but of course housing will be more prominent at that edge. My point would be, you're still going to get access to greenways, attractive vistas towards St Mildred's, access to new habitats. There is going to be a range of much greater recreational opportunities that you will get at that end of the site. And obviously at the eastern end of the site, you're going to be able to access the country park, and that will have new habitats, orchard, seating, interpretation points, all sorts of things that obviously currently don't exist. So fundamentally, yes, it can be accommodated. And I would say, yes, the experience will change, but I think that there will be housing experienced in an area where there is currently experience of housing. And I don't think even then that experience would be negative, because I think the spaces, the greenways are very attractive and very broad.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So that is my evidence in chief for Mr. Smith. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. White. Well, I thought then, before I don't know how you'd like to play this, because we've had about an hour. So I'm happy to have a break now, and then go over to Mr. Howell Williams to do the cross-examination. Is that the best thing for you, Mr. Howell Williams? I think probably, rather than have a break past the way through what you're going to give. But
I actually don't mind, so I'm happy to have a break now or a little later. Mr. Smith may have a view. I'm happy to go with what he says.
Sorry, Mr. Are you happy to continue a bit longer then and see how we get on?
I think I would, if that's okay. I wouldn't mind getting underway.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because I think we might as well just keep going now. We've got heard a bit of the evidence, so I'll keep going for a bit longer. So if you can find a convenient spot to break in about perhaps another half hour or something, Mr. Howell Williams, that might be handy. So what I'll do then is I'll hand over to Mr. Howell Williams to ask some questions. So thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Smith. Can you hear me?
I can hear you clearly, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, but in a rather tinny fashion, Mr. Smith, I'm afraid. But I can hear you. But this is quite a grating noise because of something on the wavelength. But don't worry about it now, okay? Because I can hear it.
If it's a problem for you, I have my headphones within reach here. If you want me to put those on, would you?
No, let's carry on. I'd rather you be comfortable.
Okay. Thank you.
The first document I want to look at, Mr. Smith, is the framework. I wonder whether you could get that on the screen or near to hand.
Bear with me.
Sure.
Yes, I have that.
And if you could turn, please, to paragraph 174.
Yes, I have that.
And we see there that the government wants not only planning policies, but decisions to contribute to and enhance the natural environment. You see that?
I do.
And I think that we can understand that quite readily, that the government's aim is to have positive rather than negative effects in terms of landscape.
Well, I think that's, if you'll forgive me, I'm not sure. I think that's a bit of an oversimplification, because I think if we're not careful, you might be making a direct bridge between a negative landscape effect and not complying with Para 174, which I don't think is necessarily what they're intending. I think what they're looking for is obviously something that can contribute and enhance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all effects are going to be positive.
But contribute must be a positive result, mustn't it?
Yes, but it can also mean that you minimize harm.
Fine, yes. So we're looking for something that has a positive effect and or which might minimize harm. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you can have a development, and obviously you'll be aware of this, that there are many developments that will cause localized harm, but which offer some enhancement as well. And there are many appeal decisions, for example, which accept the principle that you can have that localized harm, but that you have offered some enhancement as well. So the two can coexist.
Okay, but do you agree with me, because obviously this is a matter for submission, that the government's aim here is for positive effects rather than negative effects?
I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, Mr. Howard Williams. I'm just saying, yes, they want some positive effect. I'm just saying it doesn't preclude having some negative effects.
And so on every decision, we have to take into account that overall aim. I take your point, if this is what you're saying, that it's an overall aim and objective, but the government is looking for positive effects rather than negative effects. And that's something for the inspector to consider when looking at your scheme, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, obviously Para 174 is a consideration, without a doubt.
And when he does, he may come to the conclusion that there are positive effects. It's a matter for him, following your advice and the advice from others. But having regard to your LVIA, he should conclude, shouldn't he, that most of the effects are negative.
That's plainly not true, isn't it?
Shall we look at them? Shall we look at them?
Let's do that.
And look to D4 first.
Yes, I have that.
Okay, and if we cast our eye down the column landscape effects and look at the column to the right to understand whether the effect is positive or negative, we can see, can't we, that the majority of the effects are negative.
We can see that a number of them are negative, some of them are positive.
Sorry, Mr. Smith, I've asked you the question twice now. We can see, can't we, and would you agree that this table, so far as landscape effects are concerned, the majority are negative?
In terms of how that table is set out, and I'm really concerned here that what you're doing is you're going through a mathematical exercise.
No, I'm not, Mr. Smith. There's no maths in this. It's just a simple proposition. You can make comment on it. I just want you to agree with the question. It's quite easy. Looking at this table, which is the key table on landscape effects, in accordance with the LVIA guidance, the majority of the effects are negative, aren't they?
In answer to your question, yes. My qualification is that, unfortunately, it isn't a mathematical exercise. That some of these receptors, as I pointed out in chief, overlap each other, for example, and we can't also give them equivalent weight. For example, the AONB, we know from the MPPF, has particular importance. So all of these factors, if we just tot them up and say, well, there are this many negatives, this many neutrals and this many positives. Does that really get to the heart of what these effects are?
Yeah,
we need to use our judgment, don't we?
The effect on the A and B in this table is regarded as minor, with the nature of the effect neutral. So it doesn't really affect the question or the answer you've already given me.
Forgive me, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to make the point that that neutral effect is important, isn't it? Because what it's doing is the most valuable landscape receptor in the vicinity of the appeal site is virtually untouched. There would be neutral effects. That is a fundamental conclusion. So my concern is, I'm not disagreeing with you. There's
Okay.
I'm not a mathematical exercise, that there are lots of negatives. I'm just saying it's important we use our judgment to understanding what these results mean.
Of course, I'm not suggesting that this is the only page of your evidence, Mr. Smith, that the inspector should look at. I'm seeking to look at it to see what conclusions can be taken from what you have put forward, I hope, as a summary of the effects. That's all I'm doing, okay? So we can agree that on table D4, the majority of the effects are negative. If we look to table...
With the caveats I've made, obviously.
Yes, I don't wish to repeat all the caveat. I'll allow you to make whatever qualifications you make. I'm not unfair like that, and I'm sure Mr. White will stop me if I attempt to interrupt you. Table E3, again, I'm sure you would wish to hopefully shortly add the same qualification, but again, we can see, can't we, that the majority of the effects are negative.
Yes, mathematically that's correct, but again we have to use our judgment, and obviously the other qualification I would put on that is the one that I raised in chief about what these negative effects mean in some cases, and it's important to look at the design and to weigh that up against the visual judgments we're making. So whilst Glivia 3 might lead us towards a major negative effect, in design terms, what we've got is something that is high quality, which ticks the boxes in terms of a settlement edge design.
So far as positive results are concerned, the inspector can form a judgment with regard to this table and the supporting text as to whether or not the positive effects in terms of landscape outweigh the negative effects.
Well, in straight answer to your question, I don't think it's that straightforward. As I said, I think you have to, certainly he'll make a judgment as to how important the negatives are and how important the positives are.
Cool.
But I would also ask the inspector to consider not just the landscape visual results, but also the design of what is being produced and what that does for the settlement.
There may well be, Mr. Smith, a whole load of other things you'd like him to look at. But when looking at what the table shows, that's what he should do in looking at the LVIA results. He should look and make a judgment about the negative and the positive results and reach an overall conclusion.
Yes, as part of a number of other factors, yes.
Thank you. Now return to 174 of the framework, and we see that A, this relates, doesn't it, to valued landscapes.
Yes.
And you've heard, you know what Mr. Withercombe's professional view is, but you also know what the council's case is on that.
Yes.
And I want you also just to look to little paragraph B.
Yes.
Recognising the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside and of trees as well. And
yes.
That's a relevant paragraph, isn't it? Having regard to the issues before the inspector as they exist between the council and the appellant.
Yes.
And it ties in very much with the guidance, the GLBI guidance, to the effect that value to the countryside is not borne only on sites that are designated.
That's true, which is why we've got TGN 0221.
Exactly, and 5.53, that's the reference I had in mind in the third edition for the inspector's note. And it follows from that the government's aim here is to see that decisions in relation to the countryside should contribute to and enhance the environment of that countryside, its intrinsic character and beauty.
That's what it says, yeah.
And it's relevant and it should be taken into account, shouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And in terms of the intrinsic character and the beauty of the countryside and this important government aim, do you refer to it in your proof of evidence?
I think it's in my landscape and visual appraisal.
In the LVIA, but not your proof, do you mean?
Well, I don't replicate everything I've put in the LVA.
Just a matter of fact, I want to know whether you've taken it into account and given any comment on it in your written proof of evidence. If the answer's yes, take me to it. If the answer's no, refer me to the LVIA.
It will be no, because it's not mentioned in a reason for refusal.
So is this right? Your evidence, even where government policy is relevant, only refers to matters that are in the reason for refusal? That can't be right.
Well, hold on a second. I feel you're misquoting me here. What I've just said is that the landscape and visual appraisal includes para 174. And I have said in my proof that I haven't replicated all of the paragraphs or all of the policies, because I don't want to just copy all of that into my proof. So I've referred to it once, and I don't feel I need to refer to it again because it doesn't seem to have been a specific issue that has been raised by the council.
Okay, well,
isn't it right that we focus on the key issues of concern raised by the council?
I'm interested in what you have taken into account and what you include in your advice to the inspector on relevant considerations for his judgment. That's what I'm interested in.
Well,
if you forgive me, I'm just going to ask you the question again. If you don't feel you can answer it directly, just say, I can't answer that directly, okay?
Okay.
It's an important part of government policy. You've agreed with that. I then asked you whether or not in your proof you've taken it into account. I think you said no, because it's not raised in the reason for refusal. Is that what you said?
No, I think, again, what you said was, do I mention that policy within my proof? No, I don't. But in actual fact, what I do is I do a valued landscape assessment in my proof. So I do refer to 174A, and I do actually reassess on the basis of the new guidance for valued landscapes in my proof. So to that extent, I do touch on it.
Do you remember, Mr. Smith, I was asking you about 174B?
Yes.
Okay, not A. Okay, you refer to A. I'm asking about B.
I don't specifically refer to that, no.
No, okay. And then you said, well, don't worry, because I'm only dealing in the proof with matters in the reason for refusal, and I've already referred to it once in the LVIA.
I have referred to those policies, yes, in the LVA.
To 174A.
Sorry, I've just it's the previous MPPF that's referred to in the LVIA, which is paragraph 170 rather than 174.
That's
correct.
But yeah.
Which, of course, the new one would have come out in June 21, wouldn't it? The new MPPF came out in June, sir, is that right?
So shall we leave it here, Mr. Smith, that you haven't referred to it in your proof of evidence in the context of advising the inspector in relation to the reasons for refusal and the differences between the council's case and the appellant's case? Is it because you haven't thought it relevant to the council's case, Mr. Smith?
I haven't dealt with it specifically in my proof. 170 as it was B is mentioned in my LVA on page 7.
Yeah, I'm looking at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So obviously,
The answer to my question is yes, Mr. Howell-Williams. I've not referred to 174B in my proof of evidence, in which I have focused on the reasons for the refusal and the council's case.
that's very eloquent. I agree.
And the overall aim of the government to contribute to and enhance the natural environment, that's reflected now in the adopted local plan, isn't it? At a number of places, in particular SP1, isn't it?
Shall we go there?
Sure.
So what page is that on, please?
It's on the document, sir, is CD 2.1, and SP1 is on page 9.
Yes, I have that. Thank you.
Thank you. And you'll see it's at little b, conserving and enhancing the borough's natural environment.
Yes.
And I think you and I can probably agree that conserve can be taken to mean retain or protect from harm, in simple terms.
It can also mean minimise harm.
Where do you draw that from?
Because that's what's been accepted on many cases I've worked on.
What, there's some authoritative definition, is there, of conserve that you want to rely on?
I'm just saying that it's something that I have referred to on many cases, and it has been accepted by many inspectors that you can conserve by minimising harm.
Rather than avoiding or protecting from harm.
Rather than protecting from all harm, it can be minimising harm, yes.
Okay, so you've interpreted this policy as meaning not retain or protect from harm, but one can comply with conserve and enhance on the basis that one minimises harm. Is that right?
So I said that it could be to retain, but I said or it could be to minimise harm. Yes, yeah. I have applied those things because, as I say, that is something that has been accepted at many inquiries that I've been involved with.
So your approach to this policy, and indeed to policy SP1, and I'm assuming the same is true of HOU5 on page 209 of the local plan.
Would you like to go to that now, or
yes, please.
209, sorry.
Yeah, 209. And you'll see a little e, I beg your pardon, little e.
Yes.
It says development must conserve and enhance the natural environment.
Yes.
Okay, so you have helped the appellant evolve the scheme in the way that you've described in evidence in chief, on the basis that the policy requirements are not to retain or protect from harm and enhance, but possibly simply to minimize harm.
I have said that it could be to retain features, but it also could be to minimize harm.
Yeah, so your advice to the appellant is that this scheme will meet the government's aim and local plan policy, statutory up-to-date development plan policy, if the scheme minimises harm.
Well, that's only part of what it says, because let's go on and read the whole.
Mr. Smith, could you just answer my question? Well, and then I can make a note of your answer rather than move on to something I haven't asked you about. Is that the advice that you gave the appellant, that one can meet policy by simply
minimizing? No, it's not. No, Mr. Howell-Williams, it's not, because if we read the entire paragraph, what it says is the development must conserve and enhance the natural environment, and preserve or enhance any heritage, blah, 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 blah. So my advice is that, yes, we need to retain what we can. Yes, we need to minimize harm. Yes, we need to enhance where possible. So in fairness, I would say I want to give a fuller answer, which is that policy should be taken in the round, that you should be looking to conserve and enhance. That includes minimizing harm. It also includes retaining features. It also includes enhancing features. So that's my reading of E.
Okay, I think that's helpful. I think I got enough to make submissions on, Mr. Smith, but just can I just focus just for a moment on that word conserve, because I got the point about enhance, okay? Enhance, we can agree that that must mean positive. It's just the word conserve, and your interpretation, on which you based the advice to the appellant, is that conserve can either, is this right, retain, or it can minimize harm.
I'm saying
one or the other, it's okay. Is that your evidence?
No. What I've said,
Asked you again then.
Sorry?
I said, I'm glad I asked you again.
Well, what I've said is that I'm taking that little e as a whole, and I'm saying to my client, we need to show, as conserving and enhancing, it needs to involve the following: retaining features, key elements where we can, minimizing harm, and offering enhancement where we can. So I'm putting those two together, and I'm giving you my honest interpretation of that phrase, conserve and enhance.
Okay, so in terms of the minimize harm, have you taken that word as part of your interpretation of the word conserve?
Well, it is, isn't it, by implication, part of my definition. But what I'm concerned about, Mr. Howell-Williams, is that you might take that in isolation, and that's not what I've said.
I'm not suggesting that one doesn't take a holistic view of the merits of your development scheme. Please don't misunderstand me, Smith. Mr. Smith, I'm just trying to focus on your interpretation of the word conserve in the context of the government policy. Okay?
I hope I've been clear.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can I ask you now to look to the Ashford Landscape Character Assessment in 2009? It's core document 5.4.
Just bear with me a second.
Yeah.
Which are you going to be finding? Well, the character area. Well, which place would you like to take me to? It's quite a big document.
Sure. Let the inspector get to the document first, and then I'd like to take you and him to page 102.
Okay, just bear with me.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to have to try a different route. What was the core document reference?
Page 102.
Sorry, no, the core document reference.
Oh, CD 5.4.
CD 5.4, thank you. Yes, I have it. Sorry, 120.
102, page 102.
Okay. Yes, I have that.
Okay, and this is a landscape study at the local level, and it's useful, isn't it, and of value to the inspector because it identifies the key characteristics in terms of landscape of the relevant area for his consideration?
It's useful as a starting point, but it's not the whole answer. Obviously, it's quite high level. It's 13 years old and it's quite high level. And Livia 3 tells us that you start with the published landscape character assessments and then you do your own assessment.
Sure. Well, that's pretty much what I'm going to do, Mr. Smith, with you, okay? By no means criticising you for looking at this document as a platform for your assessment. Indeed, the purpose of the question was to get you quickly to agree, yes, it's useful. Indeed, it's what the guidance recommends. And the purpose is because it identifies the key characteristics of the relevant area.
Not always, I'm afraid, because
on this occasion, Mr. Smith, you haven't disputed it. You've not sought to avoid it. You've not said even that it's 13 years old. You've relied on it in both your proof and your visual impact assessment.
I have said that it's a starting point. I have used it within my assessment. You're absolutely right. But then I have applied my own detailed analysis.
Of course you have, Mr. Smith. Of course you have. Not every question is, I may put it this way, one that you might not wish to answer. Do you follow me, Mr. Smith?
I do. It's just sometimes, Mr. Howell-Williams, the way you're putting these questions, it's sometimes, yeah.
It makes you worried. Well, it shouldn't.
Well, no. You're saying that you're saying what you actually said, and if I can paraphrase, is you said this assessment will raise characteristics which we need to be particularly observant.
What I said was this document is useful and valuable to the inspector because it identifies the key characteristics of the relevant area. That's what I said twice.
You've said that, and that's why I'm treating that statement with caution, because I said it's a good starting point, but it doesn't necessarily deal with all the characteristics of, for example,
I didn't say that, did I? I didn't say that, Mr. Smith. It's perfectly happy to qualify as long as you answer directly in the first instance. That would be helpful. So if we look to page 102, we see that there's a list of key characteristics along the left-hand column. Do you see that?
I do.
And they're listed as being relevant to the application site in the visual impact assessment on page 20. Okay, and I'm not saying that they're all relevant to the site. Okay, I'm just providing the inspector with a relevant reference. The text is also helpful, isn't it? And again, you've referred to this in the visual impact assessment. And what I'm going to ask you, if you'd be kind enough to agree, is that so far as the appeal site is concerned, taking from the key characteristics listed there and the text, we can identify key characteristics that are referred to in this study, okay? And the first is the varied field pattern with smaller fields.
Yes.
Yeah. And a strong sense of enclosure from hedgerows.
Less strong, I would say, a sense of enclosure at the western end of the site, yes.
And field ponds as well.
Yes.
Yeah. And we see that those answers are reflected in paragraph 4.3.1 of the visual impact assessment, are they not?
Yes.
Yeah. So on this appeal site, we have identified as in existence some of the key characteristics of the landscape area described in the local character assessment document.
Yes, and we've added some, haven't we? So we've obviously added, for example, the influence of the existing settlement. So one of the things that I think is problematic with this assessment, and it's not a criticism, it's an observation of all character assessments. They are high level, and that's why we need to qualify them in more detail with more detailed assessment, particularly towards the edges, but all over this character area. It's a very big area. It will vary. And as we can see from T to B in the LVA, we, in particular, our site is obviously on the edge of this area and partially enclosed to the northwest and the south by a different character area, by settlement. And there is obviously a transition, therefore, from this character area to the transition, to the settlement, sorry. So it's really important to note that, yes, those are features, but there are other features as well because of that transition.
And those elements that are identified are part of the intrinsic beauty of this area of countryside, are they not? Pause there, Mr. Smith.
Sorry. No.
Not at all, sir. I'm just glad it wasn't my phone.
So that's the first time I've ever heard an inspector's phone go off. That's
I wasn't expecting one. So.
you made my day.
Sorry, Mr. Smith. Yeah, it was just a simple sort of follow-on question that these elements are part of the intrinsic beauty of this area of countryside.
They are one of the characteristics, I would say, is a more accurate term. They're a characteristic because they don't necessarily imply beauty, do they?
Well, I would have said that they are part of the intrinsic beauty of this part of the countryside.
Well,
but if you don't feel you can agree, that's fine. The inspector will make of that whatever he will. But
no,
I was asking the question, Mr. Smith, about in terms of the government's view that the countryside of itself has an intrinsic character and beauty, and then says, well, what are the key elements of that on this site? I would have thought he would have said the varied field pattern, smaller hedgerow, smaller hedges, enclosure, ponds, and so on.
Well, the reason why I am trying to be more specific about this is because if you look at the factors, the characteristics I've listed at 4.3.1 on page 21 of my LVA, it includes obviously the influence of the existing settlement. So in answer to your question, you said, well, these characteristics, these are elements which define the natural beauty. I obviously don't think the influence of the existing settlement is something that defines the natural beauty of this area. But I would agree that some of these characteristics you have flagged up do help to provide. I'm sorry, may I finish?
Yeah, of course.
Some of these other areas, these other characteristics, do actually provide some natural beauty. So I'm just trying to be very specific in my answer.
Sure. What I actually put to you quite specifically is that the 3 points that I made took from the study, the varied field pattern, smaller fields, the strong sense of enclosure from hedgerows, and the field ponds are not only the key characteristics of this area, but they are elements of the intrinsic beauty of this area of countryside. Do you agree?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Thank you. Now, the other element, key characteristic referred to in this study document is to be found on page 102, about 2/3 into the text, where the inspector will see it says, to the west, the tower of St. Michael's Church forms a prominent landmark feature on the outskirts of the urban area of Tenterden. You see that?
I do.
And again, you have featured that in your description of the individual elements and features on the appeal site, 4.3.1 of the visual impact assessment.
I have.
Sorry, can I just, that says St. Michael's Church, but is it St. Mildred's?
Yes, I think it should be St Mildred.
It should be St Mildred, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, well spotted.
Because I'm assuming there's not a St Michael's Church as well, but
I think there is actually, but I think there is, but it's not the prominent one they're talking about. St Mildred's is a very tall tower.
Yeah, it would be a bit surprising. So, well, let's work on that basis, Mr. Smith, and hope we're both right. Yeah, and you'd agree it's a prominent landmark feature of distinction and important to the setting of Tenterden, wouldn't you?
Yes.
So far as the policy hierarchy is concerned, there's another document to advise the inspector of, isn't there? The Ashford Local Landscape Character Assessment, the SPD in 2011.
Okay. Which is, do you want to take me to a document?
Yes, CD 2.38. CD 2.38.
.3.
Yeah, CD 2.38. I hope that's right.
I don't have that one. Is it 2.3?
CD 2.38. Yeah, I'm trying to work out how to. I don't know whether you have it hard copy.
No, I'm looking at digital copies. I've got the CD in front of me.
that's on the Ashford Borough Council website for the inquiry.
Okay. Do you know what? I'm happy for you to just tell me what you would like to take me to and just read it to me. I can't seem to find it at the moment for some reason. But
No. Well, I wonder, Mr. Smith, whether it's a document that you've looked at. It's not referred to in your evidence, I don't think. It's a supplementary planning document, and if others are looking at it on screen, I'll just try and summarize the paragraphs to you. 1.1, it's a supplementary planning document. It's dated 2011 to promote regard for the landscape and to ensure new development makes a positive contribution to it, including its key characteristics and features in which it's located.
Yeah.
So it's sort of echoing the theme of making positive contributions and looking and ensuring protection to the key characteristics.
okay.
And then what it does, it refers to two studies, one of which is the Jacob study in 2009, and that's referred to at paragraph 3.9 of the document.
Yeah.
It says that the main purpose was to ensure continued protection of the countryside and its special landscape features. And then what it does is it provides a guide how to use it, which in effect says that you need to refer to it to look to the key characteristics of those studies to which we've looked.
So, sorry, you said it referred to the Jacob study 2009, and then you said there was another study it referred to.
Yes, it's called Studio Engelbach, but it's, I don't think that's relevant to our appeal site.
Okay.
Okay, because that's referring to other areas. And then at section 4, there's a how to use the SPD, and that cross-refers to a list of key characteristics set out on the remainder of the report. And on page 15, the inspector will see that the Jacobs report and landscape type 23, Woodchurch undulating farmlands, is referred to in the document, okay? And so when one looks at it, that's pretty much what it does. But, and the reason why I was just particularly interested in it, is because if I look to, and you need to turn to this, in the local plan, policy ENV3A.
Sorry, page?
Page 275.
Yes, I have that.
Thank you. You will see there that the policy is to have to demonstrate particular regard to the following landscape characteristics proportionately according to the landscape significance of the site. And at little h, do you see that? Any relevant guidance given in the landscape character SPD?
Yes.
You see that?
Yes.
And that's a reference to the document, which I don't think you've referred to, and it sounds as if, maybe wrong, Mr. Smith, as if you hadn't looked at it, but I just asked you that. Had you looked at that?
I have looked at it, but where it took me was that it took me to the Woodchurch undulating farmland. So my judgment in writing the LVA was that I was better focusing on the landscape character assessment.
Okay. Well, I can see why you went back to the document, because that's what the policy says. But of course, what's happened here is that the recently adopted local plan, if you follow me, has incorporated in the policy this particular document.
Yes.
So the SPD has given these, if you like, the reference to these key characteristics more weight. And then more recently, further weight is given because it's referred to in a policy. Okay?
Understood. And yet the landscape character basis hasn't changed. So that, that 2009 assessment remains. Yeah. And that's obviously, that's common ground between us.
It's common ground that still remains the same, that document. It's now incorporated directly in policy. So it has an up-to-date statutory development plan policy status too, in terms of its incorporation. Do you follow me?
I do follow you, yes.
Yeah. And we can see that there's guidance in the explanatory text at 9.43, where it says all proposals coming forward should have regard to the SPD and to the guidance on landscape characteristics that it provides, so as to ensure that new development does not compromise or damage landscape character, but instead contributes towards enhancing the character of the landscape area in which it is located. Okay?
Yes.
So again, what we've got here is a consistent theme, if you like, between the government aim, objective, in relation to contributing to and enhancing the natural environment, including the intrinsic beauty of the countryside. We've identified the key characteristics evident on the site, referred to in the studies, not having lost weight by passage of time, but in fact now reflected in the up-to-date statutory development plan. And it follows from that these key characteristics are of real importance in terms of their existence on the appeal site, are they not?
Yes is my simple answer, but obviously the condition of them is important. And then there are other factors that we also need to weigh in. So the other characteristics which I've already referred to, which I won't repeat.
Sure. And of course, there are other considerations as well, Mr. Smith. So this is a convenient moment if for an afternoon break, if it suits Mr. Smith and yourself, sir.
Yeah, I'm happy for a break now. Can you give me some idea of what further time you've got on the?
Well, I'd like to think it is very difficult, and I'm sure Mr.
No, it's all right. It's not, as long as it's not sort of hours, but
No, it's not going
are
to
you
be
looking
hours.
at an hour?
No.
or something? Sorry.
No. It's not going to be hours.
No,
No, I would like to think it's going to be an hour or so.
I'd like to explain why I have my phone on is because of the number of times I've had a blackout on the on this. So I need the phone on to let me know what's going on if everything's disconnected. That's why it was on. But but I do apologise for the interference from my phone. But
Not at all, sir.
But with the technology as it was, the phone was the only way of communicating when anything went wrong. But,
Completely understand.
right. Anyway, so I apologise for that. And so what I'll do then, I'll adjourn for 15 minutes. So I'm make it about 3:25. So the inquiry's adjourned until 3:40. So inquiry adjourned. Thank you.